fight basically was over how much we could wedge in there.
Good to see you. How you doing?
Did you read the last one? Rise of Dawn? The system manager guy is securing everything.
Literally, it's in foil. Yeah, that's classic.
This is fine.
Three mics. Football off and share. I'm very glad you're here. Otherwise, it would be much worse. That and knows when national security foreign policy is. From CDT, which is an NGO.
Okay.
And stuff like this. Often I feel a little weird here because
Yeah. Sometimes when you get into the working stuff, it's bizarre.
people are like screaming at each other about things we don't understand. It's like, okay, how about you go fix it?
It's like, what happened to
Protocols, not protocols. For diplomacy, right?
Guys, question for the live stream. Do you have any slides, or is it just you? You got slides.
Yeah, but they're not significant as such.
They're
But
more like things for people to look at.
yeah,
If you can't understand what we're saying, broken English, they'll be there.
Okay. All right.
Happy to send you a copy.
but
We're just looking at the framing for the camera shots.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
occasionally get to the slide and then back.
Okay. Yeah.
You want me to give them a
It seems to be quite sensitive.
10 minutes? I'm gonna run it back.
So I got you. Go ahead. See where you went. academic background or a
Engineering
spec?
background.
Diploma.
Right.
Just Maria?
Maridia.
Maria?
Yeah.
If she could join the panel, and Maria
Yeah.
suggested you. Which, that's a sort of alignment of stars. You know. We're here,
Yeah.
we're available, and the competency.
Do you have the actual wording on slide somewhere?
Yeah, on that slide.
Okay.
And the actual wording of the norm only, not of the,
Or the definition?
not only definition.
Okay, so definition I've got on the slide deck that I sent you. So you want to drag that in or? If we want to discuss it, it would be better to be able to put it in front of people because nobody is going to already know it.
I'll add it to the end.
You guys aren't using this, are you? Joe,
Nope.
take it down. Remember, put that back up on the back.
I mean, I have to find it now.
No, you attached it to the email that you
Yeah,
sent.
I know,
earlier.
I know. IETFs. Shoot that.
Thank you. That's what I was wondering.
There we go.
2 hours.
Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. This is a panel discussion about the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. The goal of this session is to provide context around the work of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, GCSC, and what it sets out to do. We're going to concentrate mostly on the first norm that they've produced on that characterizes the public core of the internet, and what does that mean? We're going to go into a lot of depth about that. And this is essentially trying to get both asking the IETF community to think about this norm and how to actually do and work with this norm in practice, sort of in an operational sense, not just from words. And then maybe get into some of the other norms that the GCSC is working on defining amongst the commissioners. Some quick logistics for this session. This session is, say that again? I'm very mysterious. No, sorry, my name is Joseph Lorenzo Hall. I'm the Chief Technologist of the Center for Democracy and Technology. And we'll introduce the other folks here in a minute, so they're mysterious for a moment as well. This session is being recorded and archived, so be aware of that if you make statements on the mic or are in the field of view of one of the beautiful cameras we have pointed up towards the stage. This is not an IETF session, so that's why you see no note well, please don't disclose any IPR. While we're meeting at this venue, it's not part of the IETF process at all. It's basically meant to inform the work of the GCSC and in turn get some feedback from you and inform your work as well. We have very strict time concerns for this session. So we're starting right now. We need to be out of here at right around 3:15, and that means all the stuff in your lunches. And so be prepared to pack all that away because the next working group in here shouldn't have to work in your detritus. And a lot of thanks to Internet Society for sponsoring the lunch and dealing with the logistics. We just wouldn't be able to do this without that kind of work. So a quick little introduction to the commission here. This just gives you an idea of the charge of the commission. And the problem statement is essentially that governments, particularly certain governments, have been routinely attacking critical internet infrastructure for the past 20 years, and that these attacks are very costly to the private sector and have very serious second-order effects on other things that we care about around the internet, things like trust, whether or not people are going to invest in internet infrastructure, whether or not it's useful for anything. As you can imagine, military entities that do things on the internet for their own concerns often prefer offense to defense, and as we know, the defender's dilemma there, that it's very easy to do, very cheap, easy, and it's often structurally rewarded to engage in offensive actions. It's very hard for those of you like me who defend some of this stuff. It's difficult, expensive, and there's no sort of feedback loop that rewards you for defending your stuff, right? Typically, the papers come when you got a problem, not when you just did some marvelous thing. Now, so part of the thing here is that there have been some efforts to do normative activity around the internet. You may be aware of things around the Geneva Convention for things like digital activities that folks at Microsoft and others have been doing. There's been some efforts at the UN using the GG, the government process there. That hasn't gotten very far because some of the people most active on offensive operations on the internet have a veto over anything that the UN might do. And anyway, so getting on to here, I should say that the GCSC is not related to the Fairmont Sustainability Partnership, which you may have seen in your hotel rooms related to making sure your towels are hung up and stuff like that. And it's also not related to WebEx Teams, which has a very similar logo if you've seen it recently. So who are the people in front of you? Here to my left is Olaf Kochman. He's a commissioner of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. He's the Chief Internet Technology Officer at ISOC. To his left is Irina Rizmal, a researcher with the Diplo Foundation, specialized in policy analysis in matters pertaining to national security and defense. And then, last but certainly not least, Bill Woodcock, also a commissioner of the GCSC and executive director at the Packet Clearinghouse, a nonprofit agency that supports critical internet infrastructure. And I'm actually filling in for Jeff Moss, the founder of DEF CON. He's done a whole bunch of other things in his life. He's also a commissioner of the GCSC. He couldn't make it for a variety of reasons relating to a 28,000 hacker conference that he runs. Okay. So, setting the stage here really quick, the first norm that they've produced, there's two now, I believe, they can correct me if I'm wrong. This is the first norm about the public core of the internet. And what I'm going to do is start calling on folks here and start the discussion. So Olaf, could you do us a favor and read this norm and explain the various components of the statement here?
Right. So, yeah, this is a norm that came together by a conversation between various commissioners with incredibly various backgrounds. The commission is made up from people from the global north, the global south, I would say a little bit dominated by global north. People with technology background, like myself and Bill here, but also people with international law background, diplomats, spies, all kinds of people very broadly represented. So when you look at this norm and you read without prejudice to their rights and obligations, you can probably immediately see that this is one of these legal terms that sort of sets anchors the current existing international law into this norm. What the people in the Commission didn't want to do is start over, but build upon what is already there. And what is already there is, of course, our fundamental rights, it's the international law frameworks, and so on and so forth. So then it says state and non-state actors should not conduct or knowingly allow activity that intentionally and substantially damages the general availability or integrity of the public core of the internet. So first, the state and non-state actors. The norm is written towards responsibility for the overall good, and the Commission tries not to only address state actor behavior, but also non-state actor behavior. And sometimes that line in these type of things is very blurry, and you only have to read the news of certain persons meeting in Helsinki to understand that that line is sometimes very blurry. The conduct or knowingly allow is exactly to deal with that. State-sponsored hackers that do the work on behalf of states is captured here. That other piece there, the substantially damages and general availability or integrity of the public core if the internet, is trying to capture something that that is not well defined. When we started this work, we sort of all understood that the internet as a globally connected network provides something that is in the public interest for all of us. It provides us general good. But if you want to try and define what makes up the internet in detail, then things become somewhat more difficult. And Bill will go into that in a second, I think. So in its first iteration, the Commission started to use the word public core, which was sort of came out of a report that was created for the Dutch foreign ministry, no, actually it was the Prime Minister office that created it, as an input for our government's discussion around these stability issues. And that public core of the internet, we sort of all understood that that would include the internet routing system, the domain name system, the certificate and trust infrastructure that you need in order to communicate securely to each other, and communication cables. So in the first version of this norm that came out end last year, that was a footnote that sort of described the public core of the internet. And with that, I'm going to sit down. And
Yeah. So Bill, let's get into this. The Commission has recently provided a much more detailed definition than this, and I'm happy to forward through slides to get to the subcomponents of this definition of the public core. But can you explain about how it came about and why it's important, and then just let me know when you want to get into the specific details of the slides.
Sure. So to be really blunt, there's basically the U.S., Russia, and China on one side of this argument, and everyone else on the other side of this argument, with the possible exceptions of Iran and Israel. And so basically, there are the two camps, right? There's the one camp that wants to reserve what it perceives as its right to attack stuff on the internet, and the other camp that would rather not be attacked. So the effort here is to create a diplomatic norm that would put diplomatic pressure on countries that persist in attacking things. Then the question is, what is in the set of stuff that is protected by this norm? So in the fight, there are some people who want everything they care about to be in the set of stuff protected, and there are other people who would like nothing in particular to be protected so that they can continue to attack whatever they want without running foul of the norm. So this is the fight that occurs within the GCSC in trying to define these things. So last year, we did a series of surveys of people with cybersecurity expertise, people who are operating critical infrastructure, so forth, to figure out what should be in that set. And we purposely avoided using the phrase critical infrastructure because the problem with critical infrastructure is two problems with critical infrastructure. Some places that has a specific legal meaning, which is that the government will come and take it over if something goes wrong. And the bigger problem is that everybody already has some idea of what they think it means. And so different people think it means different things, and then you get into another morass. So using the neologism, the public core of the internet, was intentional because it allowed us to define it without everybody already thinking that they knew what the definition would be and skipping the fine print. So the series of surveys was to figure out what experts thought needed to be protected. It turns out that experts think that most stuff needs to be protected, and that most things are kind of interlinked with each other in such a way that if you decide that any one major area, like for instance wireless, is not going to be protected, then that has consequences for everything else. So the surveys allowed us to sort of rank and prioritize what people thought was most important, and then taking that as input to the GCSC meeting in Delhi last November, we got to fight about which things would be included. And so what we were able to get, we had divided between, on the one hand, the infrastructure of the internet itself, and on the other hand, internet accessible and ICT enabled aspects of other infrastructures. right? So air traffic control systems, nuclear power plant control systems, navigation, electricity grid, all those things are things that have ICT-enabled and internet-accessible aspects, but are not themselves part of the internet. Routing, the DNS, key servers, so forth, those are parts of the internet. So what we were able to get was the top 4 categories from the internet-specific side of things. So why don't we go through those? So this is the little lead-in to the definition saying these things are the things that the norm from last November applies to. Go ahead. So, so we're going to go through 4 of these. Each of these is whacked down by about 30% to fit on a readable slide, but there's nothing substantive removed from any of them, and you can go to the GCSC website and pull down the full and complete definitions. So packet routing and forwarding, the idea here is to get both the equipment and the sort of facilities and practices and the protocol development. The folks in the room here doing the work this week to make routing protocols continue to work. The intention is that the norm will also protect that process from compromise or attack. There's also mention of the supply chain. So the attacks the NSA has done against Cisco, intercepting routers in transit and tampering with the hardware. That's an example of something that would be protected. Exchange points, peering and core routers for major networks. One of the things that you'll see in the main norm is that it talks about general availability and substantive damage and so forth. So there are a lot of weasel words in this in order to get things through. We compromised a lot less on these definitions, but a lot more in how they apply. So next slide. Naming and numbering, this is the DNS and the in-adder side of the DNS as well, and the IP address allocation system, as well as the protocol definition for addressing. We tried to kind of throw in mention of all the different parts of that, so it would be unambiguous, the root zone, all kinds of TLDs. The exception that we carve out is for military. So like .mil is not protected here because it is a
Bona fide target.
Yes, a bona fide military target. And there is no intention in any of this to provide protection for military targets, only for civilian and to some degree dual use. Next slide. The cryptographic mechanisms of security. There was a lot of arguing about what would go in this and how it would be worded. Obviously, there are people who do not like the idea of privacy being a protected right or system. So this dances a little bit around that. It talks more about authentication and signing and so forth. There are a couple of things in there that managed to get in, even though I think they didn't score all that high on the criticality in the original survey. So password managers and roaming authenticators, things like iPass. There was also a little bit of discussion of social media authentication, all those things that say that you can log into them using your Facebook login. it was decided that that was not a protected thing.
Notably, the standardization process itself is in here as well, right?
Exactly, right. So throughout all this, we're looking more at protecting open standards and implementations of open standards than we are at protecting the products of individual companies or the customers of individual companies. Yeah, makes sense. And the last area that is included thus far is physical transmission media, which mostly I think people are thinking of that as meaning undersea cables, but terrestrial cables and this, I think, does not call out anything, right, it doesn't call out anything wireless, right? So this says specifically wired communication. Wireless was its own category that did not make it through the fight.
So you're welcome to arbitrarily jam spectrum. No, maybe.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, right? Yeah. So the one thing that we did manage to preserve was a little sentence at the end that basically says that there were other things and that the definition can be broadened over time as people recognize the necessity.
Awesome. We're going to wait till the end, but feel free to line up if you have questions now. So ARENA, I tend to keep one leg in the technical world and one leg in the policy world, and it can be kind of a weird thing to straddle, and so I'm really happy to have you here. And so there it is. There's this norm. This commission has come up with a norm. There's a definition. But now what? What's the process by which this norm gets teeth? You know, how does it get adopted? You know, there's got to be some sort of way of marketing the norm, convincing people that it's important to follow. I'm just wondering if you can talk about that.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think just to go back to the basics, we need to understand what norms are actually. So they're kind of standards and principles, and in this sense of responsible behavior in cyberspace. They're mainly voluntary at the start, but they have the opportunity to grow into actual international law and principles. And one of the bodies that was looking into this and how international law applies to cyberspace was the UNGG that you mentioned at the start. So the UNGG is a group of governmental experts that was dealing with developments in the field of IT in the context of international security. So they were talking about capacity building efforts, emerging threats, confidence building measures, recommendations on norm implementation and stuff like that. They met 5 times up until now, but they published only 3 reports. So reports are published based on consensus. And as Bill mentioned, they failed to reach a general agreement in 2017 and publish a report because there was disagreement on what you could attack and what is considered as meddling into the sovereignty of other states. Now, my personal opinion is that the UNGG process, the failure to reach a report last year doesn't mean that it should end. I think it should continue. And they met 5 times, they published 3 reports, so this is not the first time that they failed to reach agreements. Diplo carried out some research lately about roles and responsibilities in cyberspace in the context of international security, and a lot of actors still point out to the GG process as key for establishing international norms. In terms of how this norm gets teeth, norm entrepreneurship is big, but it's important to understand that it can be a double-edged sword. So on one side, you can get a lot of visibility if you get support of powerful actors. But on the other hand, you might be seen as biased if you get support of powerful actors. You might be seen as promoting their interests. I think initiatives like the GCSE initiative are important, and we've seen a spin-off of various suggestions, including the Digital Geneva Convention that you mentioned from Microsoft. I think it's important to have as many of these as possible, but until an international body agrees to adopt something like this, they're not going to have the potential of becoming international law.
Could you talk a little bit about norm entrepreneurship? I think I know what entrepreneurship is in the business context, but
It's pretty much the same. So you have a norm that you want to promote, you go and lobby powerful actors to support your norm to promote it further. Once you've had enough important actors that support it, it has the potential of being adopted and growing further in importance.
wonderful. So we're going to go to audience Q&A here in a bit, but let me ask,
Just to add to that is one of the norm entrepreneurship and going on the road with this norm and getting support from various communities is a very important aspect of the work of the GCSC. The conversation about cyber stability, and cyber stability is sort of the key word of not escalating cybersecurity events into kinetic warfare. That conversation traditionally took place among a very specific set of actors. The community that we are part of, which deals with internet governance issues as large, we in the IETF, outside of this room, because we're not in the IETF now, but this community from a very technical perspective, in the IGF there is a little bit more of a mix of different constituencies. The Net Mundial was an example of these conversations. The cyber stability and cyber military type of discussions are in a completely different room, and they hardly ever met. And what is nice about this initiative is that it actually tries to bridge between those communities, and I think that makes as a norm entrepreneur, this body as a norm entrepreneur makes what it produces more viable for adoption elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, having a multi-stakeholder approach and public-private partnerships makes any suggestion you make more feasible, because you already went through all the discussion process from both the policy side, the technical side. Civil society is usually there also to promote the human rights side, which is often forgotten. So I agree.
So where we're at right now is we've got this first norm completely out and published at this point. And so at this point, we're doing two things. One is to try and get countries to adopt this norm, to say, yes, this describes the behavior that we believe is reasonable and that we will adhere to. The other thing we're doing is writing a few subsidiary, smaller norms. One that Olaf and I and Scott Charney from Microsoft and a few other people have been working on is on non-conscription of personal devices. Basically, this is saying governments should not attack your personal devices and conscript them into botnets. So that's just an example. You'd think that would be common sense, but no. Trying to get a few of these things written down so that people will have something to point at. It will occupy some of the rest of our remaining 18 months of runtime for the organization.
great. I'm going to take chair's prerogative and ask one question myself, which is, I think the second norm involves attacks on public electoral infrastructure. And I'm wondering if anyone's prepared to talk about that. My PhD involved hacking voting machines. There's people in the room that I worked with hacking voting machines. My country, the United States, has a horrible track record of influencing other elections, and we have had that happen recently, as you can see in the news. But wondering if anyone wants to talk a little bit about that. You're welcome to say no.
Okay, so as I said, there are three countries that don't really want to see efforts along these lines go anywhere, and a lot of countries that do. The three countries that don't want to see things proceed are represented in the room in the GCSC. One of them disproportionately so, and that one is the United States. And when I say countries, I mean governments, right? They're private sector people from the US and then there are governmental people from the U.S. So the governmental folks from the U.S. Have suggested that we could instead have a norm about how Russia shouldn't subvert U.S. government or U.S. elections. It got generalized a bit more than that.
I hope so.
And it's there. This is a political process. Of course, I think that electoral processes should not be subverted. It wasn't what I got into this to argue about, though.
And just to give folks an update, there's a recent attack Cambodia's election infrastructure from China. So we're definitely seeing folks learn from this kind of stuff. Okay, we're going to go to audience Q&A. Please feel free to line up. And you don't have to state your name because this is not a IETF process, but it'd be nice if you did, but feel free.
Jeff Chaffee from the W3C. So I had a very simple question, which probably has a very simple answer, but I don't know all the weasel words, so I couldn't tell whether this simple use case is handled. So if a state actor gratuitously blocks a URL because it's from a company that the state doesn't like, is that permitted under these norms?
I would say that that depends upon how generally it affects the core of the internet. So blocking a URL is probably not going to rise to the level of what this blocks or what this protects.
Blocking lots of URLs from the same company which has a very large presence on the internet, for example?
So there was a category of applications and web stuff, basically, that did not get approved. And so search engines, for instance, were part of that, web portals to popular services, things like that. So that did not make it.
So I would request from these commissioners that you guys try harder.
So part of the problem is that of about 30 people on the commission, there are 3 people from the internet community. So we are trying hard. We need other people from the internet community to make their voices heard directly to the other commissioners, because otherwise us internet people look like a whiny little special interest.
Are there input processes for the GCSC? Like if I'm an NGO or an individual and I want to write and say, hey, you shouldn't block foo.com.
The meetings are 2-day meetings of which the first day is open, and so a lot of folks do show up for the first day.
Okay.
But unfortunately not internet community folks. It's mostly diplomatic folks.
And part of our role is to act as conduits for.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. We'll go back and forth.
I do want to go back a little bit, because that general availability or integrity of the public core, and therefore the stability of cyberspace, is sort of makes it very broad. And so unless blocking that one company has a strong impact on the stability of cyberspace, it might be a hard case to make.
Please. A little bit closer to the mic. It doesn't appear to be on.
Philip Prindeville, Network Time Foundation. You might be able to guess what I'm about to say next, but so what's the use of having a certificate that's cryptographically signed with an expiration date if you don't know what the time is? So I would posit that time servers are part of the critical infrastructure of the internet. That's one thing I wanted to say. And yeah, so I would request that it would be. Second, if for humans, hospitals are critical infrastructure, then I would posit that update servers are critical infrastructure, because if you're under attack and there's a patch out there, what good does it do if you can't get to it? And then the third thing I wanted to say, and this is an opinion, but twice Israel has taken direct action in two different forms against Iran's nuclear program. Once by bombing a reactor, so kinetic action, and there was loss of life. Another time with a Stuxnet destroying an array of centrifuges for refining uranium. And the machines spun up slowly enough that alarms started tripping and the facility was evacuated, and I believe nobody did lose life. So in the way that the Cold War was preferable to a hot war, I would suggest that cyber warfare has greater potential for achieving its goal without loss of life than hot war did also.
So this isn't about saying that you can't attack things. This is about saying that you shouldn't attack civilian infrastructure. So nuclear enrichment facility, there is no government in the world that is going to say, no, you don't have the right to attack that militarily, right? Without prejudice to their rights and obligations, this is not weasel words. This is like a nest of wolverines of weasel words, right? There's very little that gets ruled out, unfortunately, by this. And anything that looks like a military attack against a military target is not protected here.
Okay.
This is strictly trying to do the equivalent of not hospitals and schools.
Okay, so to my first question, who do I get to champion time servers then?
Both time servers and update servers were in there and haven't yet been approved. So basically, what I would recommend is that we maybe all look at the categories that didn't make it and figure out whether they can be rearranged or trimmed down or boiled to their essential parts and then promoted for addition to the 4 categories that have been already approved.
Okay, thank you.
Listen.
Alyssa Cooper. So it's possible that Olaf just answered this previously, but I want to make sure that I understand. When you had the definitions up there of the 4 categories before, it didn't really seem like they touched on either the notion of public or core. And it's certainly possible, I think, to conceive of services which are neither public nor core, or they're only one or the other, but still affect the integrity of cyberspace and stability of cyberspace. So, you know, the VPN filter exploits, I mean, people's home routers are neither public nor core, but that still seems like an attack that you would want to say, or an exploit that you would want to say shouldn't be used for an attack. So I'm trying to understand where do the public and core notions play into this?
So on the latter one, that's the conscription norm that I would say we're working on. That would cover that. A norm will not cover everything there is, and one of the things that a norm also has is a little bit of ambiguity. We've been trying to address that by creating this further definition. But sometimes the ambiguity is good and sometimes it is bad. Edge cases will be things that in public debate we have to figure out whether they're in or out. There are a couple of things that for this norm are now very clearly not edge cases, and I think that is the big win.
I wouldn't dwell too much on the word public or the word core. Think of it as like Fred, right? And here we're defining Fred. The
Okay,
word's
so
public.
it's actually meant to be extremely broad. Like it's not really meant to be limiting in any real way as to like where the infrastructure is located that is under attack, or its reachability or visibility to other parties on the internet. There's no real limitation as far as what you would normally conceive of as public and core. Like it could be private infrastructure, for example.
Correct. Core routers of major networks are
No,
included in
or
this
my router in my house.
is not, because that does not affect the general availability to a general population.
However, mass conscription of home routers would.
Right, and that's a separate norm.
And it's a
because
separate norm, but yeah.
This one per se doesn't address it directly.
Okay, thank you.
Fine reading.
Hi. So my name is Maarten Aerts, and I'm asking this question in personal capacity because I work for a government. Yeah. So my name is Maarten Aerts, and I ask this question in a personal capacity because I work for a government. So can you comment on the inclusion of response functions in the definitions? And I can understand why you would not want to include it, but I'd be interested to hear about this. So incident response or other processes which would have their parallels in the kinetic world.
Certs were one of the 26 categories that did not get approved.
However, the certs were already part of the consensus in the GGE as protected infrastructure. So. Oh yeah, CSerts, incident response.
So can you comment on the reasoning why they would not be approved?
There was no reasoning. This was a 2-day meeting, and the diplomats argued about stuff that diplomats cared about for the first day and 7/8, and in the last 30 minutes, they ran through the results of 6 months of surveying and arbitrarily, I think, said, let's take the top 4 from that category and move on.
That's insightful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ashley Heineman. I also work for a government, not representing any government, at least in my personal comments. But I just wanted to supplement the narrative a little bit with respect to the GGE and some of the reasoning behind why things happened the way they did. When this notion was first brought to the GGE, there was some concerns, particularly with my agency, in that did you really want to start this conversation among governments and governments only, particularly since this applies to non-state actors as well. So I just wanted to at least have this room recognize that it wasn't all because we weren't willing to come to agreement on this type of a norm, but more of a, we thought it was better to have a broader community discussion first to make sure that this is something that you all agreed to and thought was important, and perhaps it could be readdressed later. But I do congratulate you on coming together, and I think getting as fulsome of representation in this body is going to be the most helpful moving forward. Thanks.
Yeah, I would second of the 3 governments that are interested in reserving their right to attack things, the US government is the only one that consistently advocates for multi-stakeholderism. So having this be done multi-stakeholder is getting us somewhere, I think. At least we have these definitions and we have this input. So that's a really good thing.
I would just add that I think the reason that the UNGG process didn't reach consensus this time is also to do with the broader geopolitical and security aspects of global politics. We kind of managed to forget that cybersecurity, just as any other policy aspect, is taking place in wider geostrategic considerations. So it's equally affected as anything else, like trade and, I don't know, economic policies and stuff like that. It's not devoid of, other considerations. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Mallory Nodal. I work with Article 19. And I think you've said 2 really interesting things since I've stood in the line, so I've changed what I want to ask, which is that you want to call for more the internet community to participate in advocacy at GCSC, which is good to know that that can be done, and it's open to that. And the second thing is just on process, that because understanding where these things come from is actually really useful. Because to me, some things are really strange, like the use of the word should in this norm, which is a good norm, but it's a really weak word. And it sort of feels like, you know, if a norm in its very first draft and potentially will become more solidified in the rest of, you know, in other international law, standard setting processes, you need places to negotiate from, and you're negotiating from should. Like, you may at some point be like politely asking because you can't, I mean, should is too strong. Or again, negotiating about like what is included in the core. So for me, it's very disappointing that wireless isn't included and cables are, because of course that you know, has a huge impact on the global south where there's not as much infrastructure in the ground. I mean, I'm sure, just looking at the people on the list of commissioners, that must have been discussed, at least I hope. Oh, that's doubly disappointing. So yeah, so these things, it seems arbitrary, as you said, and it also, but it puts you in a difficult position to negotiate further down the line. So I guess my question is, like, has GCSC thought about where these norms might go in the next step? So also speaking to the call for more advocates from the internet and technical community to join you in helping you as well strategize like how that gets negotiated, renegotiated, and changed over time. Because I'm, like the first speaker, not very satisfied with this yet.
I'll just comment on the first bit of your question. In terms of vagueness of the language, norms will tend to be more vague than actual international law. The nitty and gritty will be decided in actual legal documents. In terms of should not, this is the wording that is commonly used in international treaties, documents, and initiatives, and especially with dealing with roles and responsibilities of different actors. So you have like positive and negative responsibilities, and this would be a negative responsibility, that you should not attack something or you should not impede upon something.
And as an addition, obviously the Commission is a broad commission in which negotiation already took place. So this word is the outcome of a negotiation. And that means, you know, necessarily you're not at one of the extremes of the Overton window. I hear what you say. You would like to, within the Commission, of course, we have we have different positions inside of that Overton window. And Bill here is a solid voice in the Commission. I try to be there too. But you do negotiate. So the result is a negotiated word, and should is maybe not as strong as some advocates might want to see it. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to the point on policy, I mean, I think in policy and international law documents, you do see must. You do see much stronger language. That's why when this came out, I was really shocked. I wasn't expecting it. But then maybe I'm not exactly clear on all of the people that are commissioners, because it seemed to me that it was generally a positive and sort of progressive grouping, but now it sounds like it's pretty centrist and moderate at best. But that's how it goes, and I take your point.
Well, a couple things. So one is, remember that this is a norm, so it's meant to describe a set of behavior that some nations believe that they abide by, not to compel behavior among signatories, right? So this is not a rule that somebody has to follow. This is saying we, the countries that abide by this norm, believe that it describes the good behavior that we engage in, right? So in that regard, must versus should really isn't meaningful, right? Because it's not compelling behavior. And secondly, really, if we only have the power to negotiate we're a small number of people in a big room, and if there isn't pressure from the outside, we are painted as a few whiners who just don't understand how compelling the need to attack stuff is, right? We really, really need you guys to speak up and make clear that this is not just a couple of whiners who don't understand how great offense is.
We got about 10 minutes, about a couple minutes each.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Monica Irma, journalist. There's now a new commission convened by the UN Secretary General, and it seems to have a broader mandate, but certainly cybersecurity and a potential framework for cybersecurity on the UN level is also on their plate. So how do these commissions interact? What is the relation? What do you think about that move? And then tell us about the spies in the commission.
About what?
Spies.
The spies.
I can tell you, but then I have to kill you. No.
He's one of them.
It's a standard joke. On the first one, on the UN Commission, frankly, this is not something that I'm very deeply involved in, but this is a commission that looks at the digital agenda and how the UN interacts with its broad digital agenda, which includes cyber stability issues, but which is also including IG, internet governance like things. That is a broad commission. The chair of the GCSC, Marina Kaljurand, is a member of that commission. And that's essentially the extent that I know about this. So,
but also there was an intentional separation, right? These are efforts that are independent of each other and to some degree orthogonal to each other, such that we're not trying to respond to each other and we're not trying to specifically fill gaps left by the other. This is an effort that is intended to stand alone.
Yeah, this is not an effort that has been chartered by the UN, for instance. The GCSC is chartered, came out of sort of an initiative by the Dutch government with support of the Singaporeese government. ISOC is a partner in this. Microsoft is a partner in this. So public, private, nations that are friendly to the internet model that wanted to try an alternative to the failed GGE negotiations. That's sort of the history.
Hi, Kirsty Payne from NCSC. So thank you for coming to talk to us today. I found it really interesting. One thing that I was just wanted to ask was about where we talk about the stability of cyberspace and integrity and availability. During your surveys and discussions, did anything come up about monopolization of the internet? So the fact that there is quite a lot of power in the hands of relatively few companies? Or if you will discuss this in future?
I think the answer is just no. We haven't talked about that.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. This is very much a room full of diplomats who are interested in talking about form rather than specifics to a very large degree. So that's an interesting specific issue, and it would need to be pushed somehow to gain traction within the group.
Jim Reid, almost a related question to that. Has the Commission given any consideration around the issues of internet governance and standards making organisations as being part of that core internet element? I've occasionally worried about the prospect of these things being captured or hijacked, potentially to slow down the development of policy.
Last line.
Sorry, okay, I was out the room at that time, sorry, okay.
Also,
in two places, actually.
Also on the crypto.
So,
okay, thank you.
There was, actually this was an example of us being able to sort of wedge something back in. So there was a separate category that talked about internet governance and multi-stakeholderism and standards and so forth. And when that got axed, we sort of wedged that one sentence back into the end of each of these, saying that the standardization process that supports such and such a infrastructure is also protected.
Okay, but I was also thinking about policy making, say in an ICANN forum or one of the RIRs. They could also be
the RIR process, for instance, is in there and protected.
Okay, thank you.
I meant to say thank you for that. So I just came back to say that. Thank you for including standards processes in there.
Hello, my name is Shamar Ward, and I'm a ISOC fellow to the IETF. And one question I wanted to ask is, does the norm take into consideration if I accept the norm as a government and I contract another country, for example, who has not accepted the norm to do the hacking or the attacking, is that considered?
Can you go back to the main?
But that would be using non-state actors to support, right?
Yeah, it's state actors that would knowingly conduct or knowingly allow activity that intentionally, I think it's a clear case of violating the norm, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Well, let's give everyone a hand, and please pack out your trash.
Yes, please take your trash outside. We rely on the hospitality of the IETF to be able to do this, and we want to make sure that they can reconvene their work at 1:30.
Do some things. Grab me in a second. I have to plug some crap back in.
I just want to know the consequences.